Welcome, everyone. Please settle in and find your seats. I'm absolutely delighted to see you all for today's explainer class. Today, we're diving into the dramatic and, quite frankly, cyclical nature of ancient Indian politics from roughly 185 BCE all the way to 28 BCE. We'll be tracing the rather bloody rise and fall of two major post-Mauryan empires, the Shungas and the Kanvas. So if you've ever found yourself wondering exactly how history manages to repeat itself so flawlessly, well, you are definitely in the right place today. Let's get started.
Right, so here is our agenda for today's session. First, we'll look at the power vacuum. Second, the commander's coup. Third, we cover the Vidarbha War. Fourth, institutional decay. And finally, we'll wrap up with the Kanva loop.
Okay, moving right into section 1, the power vacuum, the fall of the Mauryas. You know, it is truly fascinating how rapidly a so-called golden age can just completely deteriorate. The great Emperor Ashoka had elevated the Mauryan Empire to magnificent heights, but following his death, that central power completely fractured. By the early 2nd century BCE, the empire was so incredibly weak that Greek invaders simply started crossing the borders and occupying territories. At the helm of all this chaos was the final Mauryan ruler, King Brihadrath. He was, to put it mildly, entirely incompetent. He couldn't defend his lands at all, and as you can imagine, this caused immense, boiling frustration right within his own military ranks.
Which brings us to section 2, the commander's coup, the golden age.
So the army, and specifically its chief, a man named Pushyamitra, simply couldn't tolerate King Brihadrath's weakness for another second. In a truly shocking display of absolute power, right around 185 BCE, Pushyamitra publicly assassinated his own king. With that single, brutal act, he took the throne of Magadha and officially established the Shunga Dynasty. But I want you to notice something crucial here. He chose to keep the title of Senapati, which means commander of the army. Even as the ruling king, Pushyamitra held on to this military title. It was a very clear signal to everyone about exactly where his true strength lay.
Now, looking at the geopolitics of the time, that military background wasn't just for show, it was absolutely necessary. Pushyamitra was completely squeezed between some massive threats. To the north and northwest, you had Indo-Greek kings like Demetrius and Menander aggressively expanding. And at the exact same time, the Satavahana Empire was rising up in the Deccan, posing a huge threat from the south. Magadha's territories had actually shrunk down to just the mainland Gangetic Plains. But Pushyamitra was a brilliantly proficient warrior. When the Greeks attacked, he pushed them right back, defending Magadha beautifully, and he even managed to expand his rule southward down to the Narmada River and northwest up into Punjab and Ujjain, a real strategic masterclass.
The key takeaway here is that this was a period of intense, crucial consolidation. Pushyamitra's iron-fisted yet incredibly effective rule stabilized the subcontinent for exactly 36 years.
But it's important to remember he wasn't just some ruthless warlord. Actually, under his guidance, the empire went through a profound cultural renaissance. We see the active restoration of ancient Vedic practices that had, quite frankly, started to fade away. On top of that, the Sanskrit language was greatly enriched under his royal patronage. In fact, he reigned at the exact same time as his brilliant contemporary, the great grammarian Patanjali. So it really was a true golden age, balancing both formidable martial strength and thriving intellectual prosperity.
Let's turn now to section 3, the Vidarbha War, the next generation. Pushyamitra had a son, Agnimitra, who served as a viceroy. Agnimitra was also an incredibly accomplished warrior, and he really proved his martial prowess during the Vidarbha conflict. Here's how it played out. It all started when a loyal ally named Madhav Sen was suddenly imprisoned by his very greedy cousin, Yagyasen. Yagyasen then boldly turns around and declares the territory of Vidarbha completely independent from the Shunga Empire, while King Pushyamitra tries diplomacy first, demanding Madhav Sen's release, but Yagyasen foolishly refuses. Big mistake. This prompts Agnimitra to launch a very swift military strike, and he absolutely crushes Yagyasen. Ultimately, under Shunga oversight, the territory of Vidarbha is officially partitioned between the two rival cousins. This specific conflict was so dramatic, packed with so much political intrigue, that it literally got immortalized in classical literature. It famously serves as the historical backdrop for the great poet Kalidasa's magnificent play, Malvik Agnimitram. Agnimitra proved to be a highly capable successor who kept the empire running incredibly efficiently. However, things take a turn in section 4, institutional decay, the fall of the Shungas. Class, I want you to think about this for a second. What exactly happens to an empire when the descendants of great, battle-hardened warriors stop fighting and start indulging? Well, following Agnimitra's efficient rule, a rather tragic shift occurred. The subsequent Shunga kings who inherited the throne cared far more about their own personal comfort and, well, pleasure than the actual rigors of statecraft. They completely lost the martial edge of their ancestors.
And this kind of weakness practically sends out an open invitation for disaster. Because the central kings in Magadha were so checked out, ambitious governors across the empire sensed an opportunity. They began to revolt, carving out their very own independent kingdoms right there in the Gangetic Valley. At the exact same time, the borders were breached. Indo-Greek and Parthian rulers launched constant, relentless attacks. So you mix those external invasions with crippling internal conflicts, and the once mighty Shunga dynasty simply began to crumble like a house of cards.
Which leads us directly into Section 5, the Kanva loop. History repeats itself.
By 73 BCE, the absolute last king of the Shunga dynasty was a man named Devabhuti. He was entirely incompetent. The man dedicated his life purely to pleasure and totally neglected his royal duties. Because of this, his entire kingdom was effectively being run behind the scenes by a very ambitious man named Vasudeva. Now, Vasudeva held the title of Amatya, which refers to a high-ranking minister or government official.
Well, Vasudeva clearly saw the king's weakness and decided it was the perfect time to strike. In a genuinely ruthless, almost theatrical plot, Amatya Vasudeva conspired to seize the throne by using the king's own vices right against him. Vasudeva found the daughter of a maid, disguised her beautifully as a queen, and sent her into the king's private chambers. And as soon as she had the opportunity, she assassinated King Devabhuti. Through this incredibly bloody deception, Vasudeva snatched power and established the brand new Kanva Dynasty. Now, take a look at this. Notice this undeniable, almost eerie historical symmetry here. The Shungas began when Commander Pushyamitra deposed a weak Mauryan ruler. And in the end, the Shungas suffered the exact same fate. They were deposed when Minister Vasudeva assassinated a weak Shunga king. An empire born from the betrayal of a weak king inevitably falls to the exact same fate. History really is nothing if not poetic, wouldn't you agree?
But here is the catch. Unlike the Mauryas or the early Shungas, this new Kanva dynasty was remarkably short-lived. In fact, they only managed to hold on to their newly stolen power for a mere 45 years.
In that brief, chaotic epic of 45 years, the crown frantically bounced around between four main rulers, Vasudeva, Bhumimitra, Narayan, and finally Susharman. Because of this incredibly rapid succession and the massive inherent instability, Magadha completely lost its historic status as the subcontinent's absolute center of power.
That last Kanva king was so terribly weak, and the consequences for the Indian subcontinent were just massive. Basically, foreign invaders effectively took over. Groups like the Greeks, the Sakas, and the Parthians just swept right across the borders. But they didn't just conquer and leave. They soon integrated and became an integral part of Indian polity and society, fundamentally shifting the cultural landscape of the region forever.
And, just as before, the cycle inevitably concludes with violence. Our historical sources, specifically the ancient texts of the Puranas, record exactly how this chapter ended right around 28 BCE. The last Kanva king, Susharman, met his end at the hands of an Andhra king named Simuk. The assassination of Susharman by King Simuk wiped out the Kanva line completely, and from the ashes of this constant, spinning cycle of betrayal, Simuk officially established the Satavahana dynasty, successfully cementing its own powerful place in Indian history. So class, as we wrap up today's explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. We've just watched the Mauryas, the Shungas, and the Kanvas all fall to the exact same cycle of internal weakness and betrayal. So tell me, if every empire ultimately falls to the very sort that built it, is any dynasty's power ever truly permanent? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep studying your history, and I will see you all in our next explainer class.